Hello listeners, this is the reading of the Sabbath School lesson for the fourth and final quarter of 2022.
The series is titled On Death, Dying and the Future Hope. The author is Dr. Alberto Tim, while your readers are Percy and Sibylla Harrold. Welcome to lesson number 9, titled Contrary Passages. It's ready for teaching on November 26, and I'm Percy Harrold. Friday, November 23. From the book Christ Object Lessons, page 260, we read, in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, Christ shows that in this life men decide their eternal destiny. During probationary time, the grace of God is offered to every soul. But if men waste their opportunities in self-pleasing, they cut themselves off from everlasting life. No after probation will be granted them. By their own choice, they have fixed an impassable gulf between them and their God. End of quote. And from Testimonies to the Church, Volume 5, page 213, when those early Christians were exiled to mountains and deserts, when left in dungeons to die with hunger, cold, and torture, when martyrdom seemed the only way out of their distress, they rejoiced that they were counted worthy to suffer for Christ, who was crucified for them. Their worthy example will be a comfort and an encouragement to the people of God who will be brought into the time of trouble such as never was. And that leads us to our 4 discussion questions for this week. 1. How can the overall biblical view of human nature help us better understand some of the passages we studied during this week? 2. Reflect on the contrast between the unnegotiable religion of the Christian martyrs and the flexible religion of our postmodern generation. In other words, what are things worth dying for? However, if one has a view that all truths are merely relative or cultural, then why die for any of them? At the same time, what can we learn from those who were willing to die for causes that we believe are false? 3. Dwell more on the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. When Jesus had been raised from the dead, many believed on him. Yet many, having the same evidence, didn't believe. What does this teach us about how hardened human hearts can be to truth? What can we do to protect ourselves from a similar kind of hardness? And 4. Jesus talked about the time when the dead will live, those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil to the resurrection of condemnation, we read in John 5:29. These 2 events are 1,000 years apart, even though they sound as if they were happening at the same time. How might this help us to understand what Paul is saying in Philippians 1, verse 23? For I am hard-pressed between the 2, having a desire to depart and be with Christ, which is far better. And now it's time for Inside Story with Sibylla. Thank you, Sibylla.
Number 1, God First, by Okrain Matengu. Modesty Kakula, a businessman in Namibia, has an unusual way of sharing Jesus. Slogans painted on his 3 cars declare, Number 1, God First. Modesty's novel approach to mission outreach began when his first employer offered to sell him a car for 50,000 Nambian dollars, which is $4,000 US, in the town of Katima Mulilo. Modesty, 2 years out of high school and newly married, worked hard and managed to pay off all but 5,000 Nambian dollars, which is $400 US, in just 4 months. Then his employer changed his mind and priced the car at 60,000 Nambian dollars. Why are you changing the price just now when I'm about to finish paying for it? Modesty asked. A few months later, when Modesty had paid off all but 5,000 Nambian dollars, his employer increased the price to 70,000 Nambian dollars. Modesty tried to pay off the car again and, to his surprise, his employer then accused him of not making any payments. The case ended up in court, and the judge ruled in favour of Modesty. But the employer furiously told the court he will only get that car over my dead body. Modesty's wife, Rebecca, whispered to her husband and then asked to address the court. Weeping, she said, "Let him keep the car. God will make a way for us." The employer returned $22,000 Nambian to Modesty and fired him. At home, Modesty, with no job or income, tearfully poured out his heart to God. As he prayed, he accidentally knocked his Bible to the floor. Picking up the open Bible, Modesty's eyes fell on Romans 8:28, which says, "And we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose." "Wow!" Modesty exclaimed as peace and assurance filled his heart. The next morning the phone rang while Modesty was still in bed. An unfamiliar male voice offered to sell him a car for just $23,000 Nambian. Modesty rushed to the man's house. Sure enough, a car was available for sale. At Modesty's pleadings, the man lowered the price to $22,500 Nambian, and Modesty borrowed money from his parents to pay the balance. To testify to everyone about God's goodness, Modesty immediately painted the slogan, "Number 1, God First," above the rear window. Today, Modesty is an elder and business owner with 3 cars, each of which have the slogan above the rear window. Wherever his car goes, people point and say, "God First."
This lesson was read by Dr. Percy Harrold for Christian Services for the Blind. Sponsored by the Sabbath School Department and distributed through Hope Channel Australia, this podcast is also redistributed by Hope Channel Germany, Christian Record Services for the Blind. It is also available on SoundCloud and through multiple podcast distributors, including Apple iTunes. And you can listen and watch at the same time on YouTube. Remember, God is always faithful.